Thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Gender Based Violence 101 Masterclass. This is lesson 1. Whatever brought you here today, whether it is professional development, personal experience, academic curiosity, or something you cannot quite yet name, you are in the right place. GBV 101 is a 12-part masterclass developed by Sherna Alexander Benjamin to provide an insight into gender-based violence. I am Sherna Alexander Benjamin, a public interest and socioeconomic impact strategist and your facilitator for this masterclass. I am glad you chose to spend this time with us. My work with various stakeholders prompted me to develop discourse to provide individuals with information that can inform their activities, dialogues, and decisions. I have spent over 12 years working at the intersection of organizational health and social capital, trust and civility, ethical leadership, peace and security, non-violence, ending violence against women and girls, and socioeconomic development. I use a bespoke navigator and guide approach. That means I do not offer one size fits all answers. I meet people, organizations, and communities where they actually are. And this course carries that same spirit. I will be here for every session and will walk you through the course material. For each session, a narrated PowerPoint presentation will appear on screen to provide a visual anchor for each concept as we move through it. For lesson 1, we start with the most foundational question of all. What exactly is gender-based violence? Before we get into the content, let me tell you what this course is and what it is not. GBV 101 is not a university course. There are no exams, no grades, no prerequisites. It is a practical masterclass rooted in over 12 years of my own experience and my academic training and continuing professional development in gender, socioeconomic, and development fields. It also draws my personal experience with different forms of violence because this subject is not abstract, it is real and it matters. Understanding GBV matters before a crisis hits. It matters before someone you know gets harmed. It matters before policy gets written and budgets get allocated. Most leaders working in this space have never received structured training on GBV, yet they are designing programs, drafting legislation, and making decisions that affect survivors every day. And those decisions can impact how prevention is framed. That gap is exactly why this course exists. And you are going to hear me repeating these words throughout the course. Who is this course for? This course is for individuals who are entering the gender field, emerging development practitioners, social workers and counselors, law students and advocates, policy and governance students, aspiring electoral candidates, business students and HR professionals, and anyone who simply wants to understand gender-based violence more fully. If that is you, welcome. Here is the roadmap for what we will cover in this first session. 5 learning objectives, and by the time we finish, I want you to walk away with a clear understanding of what GBV actually is, not the version that gets flattened in headlines, but the full picture of what GBV is. Let's begin. I want to start with a question. Take a moment and sit with this before we move forward. Have you ever been in a conversation where someone used the terms gender based violence, domestic violence, and violence against women as if they all meant exactly the same thing? Take a moment, think about where you first heard those terms. Think about the context: a news article, a training session, a conversation with a colleague, a lecture, a policy brief. Most of us have been in that conversation. Those terms get used interchangeably in newsrooms, government offices, classrooms, and even among development professionals who should know the difference. This is not about ignorance or judgment. It is mostly about history, and today we are going to explore GBV through a different lens. So, again, we come back to this idea of why understanding matters. It matters before a crisis hits. GBV affects 1 in 3 women worldwide, yet most practitioners cannot define it precisely. Policy is written, budgets are allocated, and programs designed by people who have never received structured training on GBV. Terms are used interchangeably in newsrooms, classrooms, and government offices, creating gaps that cost lives. Additionally, the digital world has opened entirely new fronts of violence that old frameworks do not capture. The field is growing. Social workers, lawyers, advocates, and public officials need a shared foundation. Take 3 seconds to pause this video and reflect on what stood out to you thus far. What felt easy for you? What is one thing you questioned? What was an aha moment? So, what is gender based violence? Gender based violence, or GBV, refers to harmful acts directed at an individual or group based on their gender. It is violence that is enabled, excused, or driven by gender inequality, by the unequal power that societies assign to men and women, boys and girls, and to anyone who does not fit neatly into those 2 categories. I want to pause on one word: gender. Gender is not biology, it is social, and might I add, economic and political. It is the set of rules, expectations, and norms that a society assigns to people based on whether they were born male or female. Gender based violence is rooted in those social, economic, and political constructs, and that distinction matters enormously, which means it is not inevitable. It is produced by systems and norms created by human beings, which means we can change them. This is foundational. Keep it with you as we move through this masterclass. I thought to include some key scholars who have shaped how we understand gender based violence. So, scholars like Laurie Heiss, who developed one of the earliest ecological frameworks for GBV in 1994. Sylvia Walby, whose work on patriarchy as a system of social structures helps us understand why inequality persists. And R.W. Connell, whose research on hegemonic masculinity explains how dominant norms of manhood create conditions for violence. Now that we have a definition, let us discuss what GBV actually encompasses, because this is where many people are surprised. Think of GBV as a large red umbrella. It is an umbrella framework, and it was designed to bring visibility to the full range of violence rooted in gender inequality. The umbrella term matters because it shows that gender-based violence can affect anyone, not just women, not just people in intimate relationships, anyone. The umbrella shows us how different forms of violence connect. They overlap, they intersect, and they rarely travel alone. Underneath that umbrella, you find many distinct forms of violence. Let me walk you through some of them. Intimate partner violence, sexual violence, including rape, sexual assault, and coercion, sexual harassment in workplaces, schools, and public spaces, stalking and gender based harassment, dowry related violence, gaslighting, early and forced child marriage, forced pregnancies, property control, forced abortions and non-consensual sterilization, female genital mutilation and cutting, human trafficking and sexual exploitation. Honor-based violence, yes, that word honor-based. Online and digital GBV, including image-based abuse, cyber harassment and doxing, psychological and emotional abuse rooted in gender power dynamics, economic abuse that strips a person of financial independence, conflict related sexual violence, violence against LGBTQIA plus persons based on gender identity or sexual orientation. That is a broad list that captures only a few forms of GBV, and it is meant to be because GBV is a broad reality. Now, here is something I want you to hold on to as you process this list. These forms of violence do not always travel alone. They overlap, they connect, they overlap, they connect. A survivor of human trafficking may simultaneously be experiencing sexual violence, economic abuse, and digital surveillance. A woman fleeing domestic violence may also be the victim of stalking and image based abuse. The various forms of GBV intersect and reinforce each other, which means that in most real world cases, a person will experience more than one form of violence at the same time. Let that sink in for a moment. This brings us to a concept that will come up across this course, the continuum of violence. Scholars Nancy Shepper Hughes and Philip Bowers described violence as a continuum, a connected chain that runs from subtle everyday acts to extreme overt harm. The key insight is this: acts of violence are not random or isolated. Everyday behaviors that get dismissed as minor, a controlling comment, a joke that humiliates, a partner checking your phone, can sustain and escalate into severe violence. No act exists in isolation. Violence runs on a spectrum, and understanding that spectrum is essential for prevention, for policy, and for support. We covered a lot in the last few minutes. You would agree with me that a pause and reflection time is needed to process some of that information. Take a minute to pause this video and reflect on what has stood out to you thus far. What landed easily for you? What are two questions that emerged for you? What stood out to you? What was a learning moment of deep reflection? Let's explore if everyone is equally affected. Now, does the umbrella mean everyone is equally affected? The data says no. And we should be honest about that. When we reduce GBV to just domestic violence, we leave out survivors of trafficking, harassment, and digital abuse. We leave out boys and men who experience sexual violence. We leave out LGBTQIA plus people facing violence rooted in rigid gender norms. We leave out victims of digital abuse and cyber harassment who navigate experiences of harm online. We leave out children in forced marriages, and what happens to them is treated as cultural rather than GBV. GBV as an umbrella insists we see all of them, not just the most visible. But using the umbrella does not mean we flatten the data. Here is the reality. Globally, approximately 1 in 3 women has experienced physical or sexual violence in her lifetime, predominantly by an intimate partner, who 2021. 38% of all murders of women are committed by intimate male partners, UN Women 2023. Women and girls make up approximately 72% of all human trafficking victims globally, UNODC 2022. The GBV umbrella does not obscure this reality, it contextualizes it. Understanding who is the most at risk is not a side note. It is what drives effective policy, programming, services, advocacy, and leadership. Let's meet Kimberly Crenshaw, American legal scholar, civil rights advocate, and UCLA Columbia law professor. In 1989, she published Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, introducing the term intersectionality to describe how Black women's workplace discrimination fell through the cracks of both race, law, and gender. In 1991, she expanded the framework in Mapping the Margins, linking intersectionality to violence against women of color. Today, intersectionality is now a foundational concept in gender studies, policy, law, development work, and human rights frameworks worldwide. Intersectionality looks at how various factors converge and how our identities do not exist separately, they overlap and interact. A person can face discrimination not just because of gender, but because of how gender combines with race, class, disability, religion, and more. The discrimination that results is not additive, it is compounded. Crenshaw used a road intersection to explain. So imagine two streams of traffic, race discrimination and gender discrimination. At the intersection, a black woman can be hit from both directions at once. Standard race laws cover only one road. Standard gender laws cover only the other road. She falls through the gap. These are some of the scholars who contributed to shaping the GBV field, and they are by no means all of them. You can now research more people who have contributed to shaping the GBV field, including specific areas of violence under the umbrella, and you can share some of those with us in the comments. Let's now explore the digital dimension. Before we move on, I want to spend a moment on something that did not exist in older definitions of GBV, but is now one of the fastest growing areas: digital violence. Violence that happens offline does not stay offline, it follows people. An abusive partner who controls a woman's movements will often extend that control into her digital life, monitoring her phone, hacking her accounts, sharing intimate images without her consent. Online violence causes real offline harm. We cannot treat them as separate domains. For women in public life, online abuse is frequently a deliberate strategy to silence them. Research consistently shows that female politicians and journalists receive a disproportionate volume of online threats compared to their male counterparts, and those threats are frequently sexual in nature. Online violence causes real offline harm. It isolates, it damages professional reputations, it drives women out of public spaces. We cannot treat digital and physical violence as separate categories. They are part of the same continuum. Now it's time to get up and stretch and take a water break. Take a minute to pause this video and reflect on what has stood out to you thus far. We saw that GBV does not manifest the same way for everyone. Where have you seen GBV manifested differently? And which populations, even among women, were affected the most? In your opinion, does the data actually reflect the prevalence of violence against women? Have you observed GBV manifested online against someone, and whom? What was a moment of deep learning for you? Now let's move into why the terms get used interchangeably. I want to address something directly because it comes up in almost every training I deliver. Why do people use GBV, domestic violence, and violence against women, as if they mean the same thing? Is it carelessness? Is it ignorance? No, it's mostly history. And that history deserves respect, even as we move ahead and draw on its foundations. The feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s did something critical. They named violence against women in the home for what it was. They used the language of battered women and domestic violence to break a silence that had been maintained for centuries. That language saved lives. It opened the first refugees, the first hotline, the first legal protections. In 1979, CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, placed the phrase of violence against women into international law. It gave advocates a legal framework. In 1993, the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women followed. In 1995, the Beijing Platform for Action went further. With each moment, the conversation expanded. Now I want to pause on a landmark moment. Yes, a landmark moment. One that does not always get the attention it fully deserves in global conversations, in regional conversations, and in just everyday conversations. But that was genuinely transformative, but one that was genuinely transformative for Latin America and the Caribbean, and for the field of GBV as a whole. On June 9th, 1994, in Belém do Pará, Brazil, something historic happened. The Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women was adopted. It is known as the Belém do Pará Convention, and it holds a distinction no other international instrument has. It was the world's first legally binding treaty to explicitly focus on and define violence against women. It established that violence against women is a violation of human rights, not a domestic matter, not a cultural norm, not a private issue, a human rights violation. Full stop. It defined violence against women in a way that was comprehensive and actionable, covering physical, sexual, psychological violence in the home, the community, and perpetrated or condoned by the state. It defined the due diligence duties of states. Governments that signed on were not simply expressing good intentions, they were accepting legal obligations around prevention, investigation, support for survivors, and punishment of perpetrators. For Latin America and the Caribbean, this was a shift in the ground. Advocates now had a regional treaty they could invoke before the courts and before states. Women's rights organizations could point to a legally binding document and say, your government signed this. These are your obligations. You are not meeting them. That is a different kind of power than a UN declaration. Declarations express intent. A binding convention creates accountability, and accountability needed a mechanism. That is where MASECV comes in. MASECV, the mechanism for follow-up on the Belém do Pará Convention, was established to monitor how states party to the convention are actually implementing their commitments. It produces hemispheric reports, assesses national legislation, and tracks progress, or the lack of it, across Latin America and the Caribbean. MASECV gave the convention teeth. Without it, the commitments on paper could remain exactly that, on paper. The follow-up mechanism transformed a legal instrument into a living accountability process. And that is the model the field has continued to build globally. If you are working in the Americas, in development, gender, human rights, socioeconomic development, law, policy, or advocacy, understanding the Belém do Pará Convention and MASECV is not optional background knowledge, it is foundational. We all know that habits take a long time to break, and language is no different. Language changes more slowly than understanding. Old habits stuck. Violence against women became shortened for everything, even when the field itself had moved forward. Gender-based violence emerged as the more accurate term, but it has not yet replaced the older phrases in everyday usage. Part of what this masterclass does is share information to update our vocabulary and align it with our current understanding. Precise language is not pedantry, it is accountability. Let's now identify some organizations that have contributed to shaping the GBV field and continue to do so. I want to pause here to acknowledge the thousands of non-governmental organizations, non-profits, community-based organizations, and advocates who, without their contributions, many of these organizations would have a difficult time advancing their mandates. So we have WHO, the World Health Organization, which produces the most widely cited global prevalence data on GBV. MASECV, which through the Balam-Dupara Convention holds state parties accountable, producing country reports, hemispheric reports, and thematic-based reports. UN Women, the United Nations entity for gender equality and women's empowerment. UNICEF, leading work on child marriage, FGM, and violence against children. UNFPA and UNHCR, working on GBV in humanitarian and conflict settings. International Rescue Committee and CARE International, frontline programming in crisis context. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, advocacy, documentation, and accountability. Before we move to a knowledge reflection, let's just take a pause. What are some of the things that stood out to you? What are some of the things that you were like, wow, this is the first time I'm hearing anything about this. I need to go and do some more research. And what are some of the things that landed deeply for you? Reflect on those as we proceed to the knowledge reflection. So let me take some time to answer some of the most common questions I hear when I introduce this topic. Is GBV only about women? No. GBV affects women, girls, men, boys, and gender diverse individuals. Women and girls are disproportionately affected. The data confirms this consistently, but the framework captures all violence rooted in gender inequality, regardless of who the victim is. What is the difference between GBV and domestic violence? Right. Domestic violence refers specifically to violence within a household or intimate relationship. GBV is a much broader term. It includes domestic violence, but also covers sexual violence outside the home, trafficking, harassment, FGM and cutting, digital abuse, and more. Domestic violence is one form of violence under the GBV umbrella, not a synonym for the whole. Why do people use these terms interchangeably? Well, largely because of history. Early feminist movements, quite rightly so, centered women's experiences of violence in homes and intimate relationships. The language of domestic violence and violence against women became embedded in law, policy, and public consciousness. Over time, the field evolved and the language became more precise. But old habits are slow to change, as we all know. Part of what this course does is update our vocabulary to match our current understanding. Can men be victims of GBV? Yes. Men and boys can experience sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and violence rooted in rigid masculinity norms, including violence for being perceived as not man enough. GBV frameworks are increasingly designed to capture these realities, while still acknowledging that women and girls carry the heaviest burden statistically. Does using the GBV umbrella mean all experiences of violence are the same? Not at all. The umbrella brings visibility to all forms of violence without suggesting they are identical. It allows us to see patterns, connections, and shared root causes while still recognizing the specific and distinct experiences of different groups. Nuance and breadth are not opposites. Okay, take a breath, drink some water. Learning is only as powerful as what you do with it. Here are three things I want you to do before you move on to lesson two. And lesson two is not posted as yet. When you subscribe, you will get the notification when it is posted. These are outside, of the comment section. They are real world action. So we could comment in the comment section here, but the real action happens in the real world where you engage with people, where you sit with them, you talk, you identify gaps in policy, identify gaps in your organization, work environment. So action one. Audit your language. For the next 48 hours, pay attention to how GBV, domestic violence, and violence against women are used around you. In the news, in conversations, at work, notice when they are used as if they mean the same thing. That noticing is the beginning of a change. So go out, spark some conversations, and listen to what people have to say. Action 2. Start a personal glossary. Open a notebook or document and write down your own working definitions of the three terms from this lesson. Do not copy and paste, write them in your own words, because when you do that, you're able to relate with them more. Your mind is able, your brain is able to remember them and to classify them in a correct way. So do not copy and paste, write them in your own words. This forces you to process what you have learned, as I said earlier, and gives you a reference point to build on through the rest of the course. They are used as if they mean the same thing. That noticing is the beginning of a change. Action 3. Have one conversation. Share what you learned about the GBV umbrella with one person this week. A colleague, a classmate, a family member, a friend. Teaching what you know is one of the most effective ways to make it stick. And every informed person in your network is one fewer gap in the system. Before we move to lesson 2, pause here. Comment below what stood out to you in this lesson, what challenged you, what landed differently than you expected. Share this lesson and this channel. Every time you share, you put this knowledge into the hands of someone who may need it. Awareness travels as far as the people who carry it. And education is one of the most powerful ways we build healthy behaviors. Healthy behaviors are how healthy societies grow and flourish. Again, like the channel, subscribe so that more people can find this content. Comment under the content and tell us what topics you want us to explore after this masterclass. This space exists for you. Your questions shape where we go. To access course materials or connect with us directly, email alexinaconsulting@gmail.com. Remember, gender-based violence is an umbrella. It is broad by design. It includes domestic violence and violence against women, men, and children, and it reaches much further. into digital spaces, schools, workplaces, and the lives of people of every gender. And it is always at its core about power, control, and inequality tied to gender. In lesson 2, we map that picture more fully. Where does GBV happen? When? How is it carried out? And by whom? We will see you in lesson 2. And I end with a closing reflection. We have come to the close of lesson 1 in the GBV Masterclass. Yeah, by launching this GBV Masterclass 101, which contains 12 parts. As you prepare for lesson 2, remember to take those 3 actions and write down your results so you can share in the comments. And take some time to reflect on what was something new that you learned. What stood out most for you during the session? What organizations are working in this area in your community? What landed well for you? What was challenging to grasp, and what would you like more clarity on? Thank you for staying on to the end. We look forward to seeing you in lesson 2. And remember, sharing in this instance is caring, because when you share this information, it is one less gap to fill.